"You think I won't pull this trigger? Try me." Ray jammed the shotgun barrel hard against Claire Morgan's chest, so close she could feel the cold metal through her uniform. 6 customers stopped breathing. Derek screamed at the register. Every single person in that diner was certain someone was about to die. Then Claire did something nobody in that room could explain afterward. She did not beg. She did not run. She looked straight past the weapon, straight into the eyes of the boy holding it, and said, quiet as a prayer, "I see you, and you don't have to do this." The most powerful mob boss in Pittsburgh sat frozen in the back booth, watching a waitress do what no one in his entire world had ever dared to do. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, hit the bell, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The night had been slow the way November nights in Pittsburgh always got slow after midnight. The kind of slow where the coffee sat too long in the pot and turned bitter, where the fluorescent light above the third booth buzzed just loud enough to notice where the only sound that really mattered was the hiss of the radiator against the far wall. Claire Morgan had been on her feet since 4 in the afternoon. Her lower back ached in that particular way it always did on double shifts, a dull, grinding ache that started somewhere behind her left hip and spread outward like a slow fire. She was 34 years old, and some nights her body reminded her of that more aggressively than others. She wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time that shift. She straightened the sugar dispensers. She checked the clock above the kitchen window, 2:14 in the morning. 3 more hours. She could do 3 more hours. There were 6 customers inside the Riverside Diner at that hour. She knew most of them by face, if not by name. There was George Pulaski, 81 years old, who came in every Wednesday and Saturday night, regardless of the weather, ordered black coffee and a slice of whatever pie was left, and never once complained about anything. He had a heart condition that his daughter worried about, and he never mentioned. There was Sandra, a nurse coming off a 12-hour shift at Allegheny General, still in her scrubs eating scrambled eggs with the focused efficiency of a woman who had learned not to waste time on anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. And then there was the man in the corner booth. The dark booth, the one at the very back of the diner where the overhead light had been out for 2 weeks, and Maria kept forgetting to replace the bulb. Claire had noticed him when he came in around 1:30, not because he was loud or demanding, he was neither. He ordered black coffee, said please, and did not look up from the table for the first 20 minutes. But Claire noticed people. She always had. It was not a skill she had been taught. It was something closer to a survival instinct developed over years of working in places where reading the room was the difference between a manageable night and a dangerous one. The man in the dark booth had expensive shoes. Not flashy expensive, quietly expensive, the kind that said the person wearing them had never needed to think about whether they could afford them. His coat was well cut. His hands, when he wrapped them around the coffee cup, were the hands of someone who had not done physical labor in a long time, if ever. But his eyes, when he finally looked up, were not the eyes of a relaxed man. He was carrying something heavy. Whatever meeting or conversation had brought him out at 1:30 in the morning to sit alone in a diner, it had not gone the way he wanted. She refilled his coffee without being asked. He looked up. "Thank you," he said. "Sure," she said, and moved on. She did not know his name. She did not know that his name was Julian Moretti, or that in certain parts of Pittsburgh, that name produced a very specific kind of silence, the kind that fell over a room, not because people had nothing to say, but because they understood at some wordless animal level that saying the wrong thing could cost them something they could not afford to lose. Claire did not know any of that. She knew he was troubled. She knew he was trying very hard to appear as though he was not. She made a mental note of it the way she made mental notes of everything that mattered in her diner, and she moved on. At 2:17 in the morning, the front door opened. Claire heard it before she saw it, the specific sound of the door being pushed open too hard, too fast, with more force than a person needed if they were just coming in from the cold for a cup of coffee. She turned from the counter automatically because turning toward the door was reflex after 10 years of service work. She saw them in the first half-second and understood what she was seeing in the second half-second, and in that single whole second, her entire nervous system made a decision she had no conscious control over. Stay calm. There were 2 of them. The one in front was older, maybe late 30s, with a stocky build and the kind of face that had been in more than a few fights and had learned to enjoy them. He wore a gray ski mask and moved with a purposeful, practiced quality that told Claire this was not his first time doing something like this. He was holding a handgun, a semi-automatic she registered, without knowing why she registered it, and he swept it across the room in one confident arc, claiming the space, making sure everyone understood immediately what kind of situation this had just become. "Nobody moves," he said. His voice was flat and hard. "Nobody does anything stupid. This takes 5 minutes and then we're gone." The man behind him was different. He was younger, barely 20, Claire guessed, maybe not even that, and he was holding a shotgun that looked almost comically oversized against his narrow frame. He was wearing a black ski mask, but it had shifted slightly to one side, and through the gap, she could see that his left eye was watering. He was breathing too fast, short, shallow breaths that she could actually hear from across the room. His hands, and this was the thing that sent a cold, specific terror through her chest. His hands were shaking, not trembling slightly, shaking, and his finger was too close to the trigger. Not on it, not yet, but too close, hovering in a place that left no margin for a loud noise or a sudden movement, or someone's coffee cup slipping off a table. Derek, though, she didn't know his name yet. She would learn it later, would read it in newspapers, would hear it spoken in a courtroom. Derek strode to the counter and pressed the gun flat against the glass case where Maria kept the pies. "The register," he said. "Open it." Claire did not move immediately. Not because she was frozen. Not because she was planning something dramatic. She did not move because she had assessed the room in the time it takes most people to blink, and she understood that the most dangerous thing in the Riverside Diner right now was not the gun Derek was holding. It was the hands of the boy behind him. She needed a second. She gave herself exactly one. Then she said clearly and calmly, not loudly, but in the kind of voice that carries without effort, "I'm going to do that right now. I'm just going to move my hand to the register. That's all I'm doing." She narrated every movement before she made it. Right hand to the counter, left hand to the register, finger on the button. She spoke as she moved low and even and unhurried in the tone she used when she talked new kitchen staff through their first Saturday night rush. "This is what's going to happen next. This is all that's happening. Nothing else is happening." Derek watched her. Something in his posture shifted, not much, but enough. He had expected panic. He had planned for panic. Panic was something he knew how to use. Calm was something he did not quite know what to do with. "Faster," he said. "I'm going as fast as I safely can," Claire said. Not defiant, not sarcastic, just honest. "I don't want to make any sudden movements and scare anybody." Anybody, she thought. She meant the boy with the shotgun. She was already talking to the boy with the shotgun. George Pulaski in the third booth let out a sound. It was a low, strained sound, not quite a groan, not quite a gasp, and Claire's eyes went to him immediately. His face had gone the wrong color, not white with fear, but gray, and he was pressing one hand flat against the left side of his chest. Sandra, the nurse, was already half out of her seat. "Sit down," Derek barked. The gun swung toward her. "Sit down." Sandra froze, half standing, her eyes moving between Derek's gun and George's face. Claire said, "His heart." Quiet. Flat. Just 2 words. Derek looked at her. "The man in the booth," Claire said. "He has a heart condition. He needs his medication. It's in his jacket pocket. If he doesn't take it in the next couple of minutes, we're going to have a very different kind of emergency in this room, and that is not going to be good for anyone." Silence. The young man behind Derek, Ray, his name was Ray, though she would not learn that until later, either shifted his weight. The shotgun moved slightly. His breathing was still too fast, but he was looking at George now, and something in his expression changed. It was small, barely there, but Claire saw it, a flicker of something that was not fear and not calculation and not the performance of menace, something human. "You trying to play me?" Derek said. "No," Claire said. "I'm trying to keep everyone in this room alive, including you. The old man needs his medication. I need you to let me help him. That's all. After that, you take whatever's in the register and you leave, and no one in here causes you any trouble." A beat of silence that felt like it lasted considerably longer than it did. "Move slow," Derek finally said. Claire came around the counter. She moved exactly as she said she would, slow, deliberate hands visible, no sudden changes in direction. She crossed to George's booth and crouched beside him and said very quietly, "George, your jacket pocket. The little pill case. Can you tell me which pocket?" "Left," George managed. His voice was thin. "She found it. She opened it. She helped him get the nitroglycerin tablet under his tongue, and she stayed crouched beside him while he breathed, while the color in his face slowly changed from gray back towards something more like the gray-pink of a cold November, and she counted his breaths, the way you count steps on ice carefully with your full attention. Derek watched all of this. He had a gun in his hand, and he was watching a waitress save an old man's life in the middle of his robbery, and his grip on the handle tightened, because this was not how this was supposed to go, and he did not know what to do with that. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, back behind the counter." Claire stood. She looked at Ray as she turned. Just for a moment. Just one glance, direct and deliberate and human, the way you look at someone when you want them to know you see them, not the mask, not the shotgun, not the performance of danger. Them. Ray looked back. His hands were still shaking, but his finger had moved. It was no longer hovering near the trigger. It was resting against the guard. It was not a big change. It was an enormous one. Claire went back behind the counter. She finished opening the register. She put the bills on the counter. She did not throw them, did not shove them, placed them and said, "That's everything in the drawer." Derek swept the bills into a bag without looking at them, his eyes still moving around the room, landing on each face, calculating reading. He was good at that. Claire could see that he was good at it. He had done this before, and he understood something about control, but what he understood about control was that it came from fear, and what he could not understand, what his entire model of the world had no framework for, was a person who was afraid and not controlled by it. "Let's go," he said to Ray. And this was the moment. Claire knew it was the moment the way you sometimes know in the middle of an experience that you will remember it for the rest of your life. She did not look at Derek. She looked at Ray. She said, and her voice was so quiet that later the other customers would struggle to remember her exact words. "You don't have to be responsible for what he decides. Leaving without hurting anyone is still a choice you can make." Ray looked at her. Derek turned. "Ray, let's go." Ray did not move. "Ray." Harder now, a warning under it. "I heard her," Ray said. His voice was thin, unsteady, but they're actually present in a way it had not been since he walked through the door. "I don't care what you heard. We're going." "She's right." Ray's voice cracked on the second word. "Nobody's hurt. We could just fire a warning shot," Derek said. It was an order disguised as a suggestion. "Ceiling, do it now." Ray looked at the shotgun in his hands. He looked at Derek. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at Claire. He lowered the shotgun. Not halfway. All the way. The barrel dropped toward the floor and he took a step backward and said, "I'm not doing that." What happened next was fast. In a way that intense moments always are not slow motion the way people describe afterward when they're trying to make sense of it, but genuinely fast compressed the events of the next 45 seconds, arriving in a rush. Derek swore. He grabbed the bag. He shoved through the door and was gone into the cold before the bell above it had finished swinging. Claire had already moved. She had pressed the button beneath the counter, the exterior alarm, the one Maria had insisted on installing 3 years ago after the third break-in on Banksville Road, and she was pointing toward the kitchen, looking at Sandra, at the 2 other customers she hadn't had time to learn anything about, at a young couple who had been sitting near the window and had spent the entire ordeal gripping each other's hands under the table. "Kitchen," she said. "Side door. Go." They went. George could not move quickly. Sandra stayed beside him, and between the 2 of them, they made it through the kitchen door, while the alarm began its flat, relentless screaming outside. Ray stood in the middle of the diner. He had set the shotgun on the nearest table. His hands, without anything to hold, looked very young and very lost, and he was standing completely still in the way that a person stands when they have just made a decision and their body has not yet figured out what comes after. Claire looked at him from across the counter. Outside, the alarm was going. In the distance, she could hear it a siren. She said, "Sit down." Ray looked at her. "Sit down," she said again. "It'll go better if they come in and you're sitting." Ray sat down. He put his hands flat on the table. He did not run. The police were there in 4 minutes. Claire stood behind the counter while they came through the door, and it was only after the second officer had put his hand on her arm and said something she would not remember later, something about being all right about it being over, that she noticed her hands. They were shaking. They had been perfectly still for the entire ordeal, and now with the danger gone and the adrenaline beginning to metabolize, and her nervous system finally understanding that the worst of it had passed, her hands could not stop shaking. She pressed them flat against the counter the same way she had placed them at the very beginning, and she breathed. She had not been fearless. She had never been fearless. Fear had been present every single second of the last 23 minutes. She would calculate the exact duration, later compulsively, the way people revisit the math of experiences that have altered them. Fear had been absolutely, completely, undeniably present. It had told her about Derek's practiced violence and Ray's dangerous instability and the precise angle at which a shaking hand might accidentally do something it did not mean to do. Fear had given her every piece of information she needed. It just hadn't told her what to decide. That part had been hers. From the corner of her eye, the dark corner, the booth where the light had been out for 2 weeks, she saw him stand. The man with the expensive shoes. The one who had ordered black coffee and said please and carried something heavy in his eyes. He walked past 2 police officers without being stopped, which she would later understand said something significant about the kind of authority he carried without announcing it, and he paused at the counter. He did not say anything for a moment. He simply looked at her in the way people look at something that has genuinely surprised them, and genuine surprise, Claire knew, was the rarest expression on the face of a man who had seen as much as he had seen. He reached into his coat pocket. He put a business card on the counter beside his untouched coffee. He had never touched the coffee. She noticed that now. And then, without a word, he walked out into the Pittsburgh cold. She picked up the card. It was heavy stock, cream-colored, with a name embossed in plain black letters, Julian Moretti, a phone number, an address on the North Shore. She turned it over. On the back, in a precise and careful hand, he had written 7 words, "You saw the frightened person before you saw the weapon." Claire read the sentence twice. Then she set the card down on the counter. Then she picked it up again and put it in the pocket of her apron, because it occurred to her that she would want to think about those 7 words, and thinking about them required having them somewhere she could find them. The officer who had put his hand on her arm was asking her something. She answered. She answered all of the questions, every one of them, and she stayed in the diner until nearly 6 in the morning, giving statements and drinking coffee that had definitely sat in the pot too long and turned bitter. George Pulaski was checked out by paramedics at the scene, and after some argument agreed to be transported for observation. He called the diner 2 days later to tell Maria he was fine, and to tell Claire she had done something he would remember for the rest of his life, however long that turned out to be. Sandra, the nurse, sent a card. The couple from the window table left before anyone thought to get their names, which the detective on the case mentioned with some frustration, and which Claire found oddly completely understandable. Some people, when the danger passed, needed to be somewhere else immediately. She did not hold it against them. Ray was 19 years old. She learned this from the news the next morning when she could not sleep and sat at her kitchen table reading the online coverage on her phone with the volume off and the screen brightness turned all the way down as though the information might hurt less if she received it quietly. His last name was Tillman. He had been recruited by Derek 8 months earlier. He had no prior violent offenses. He had, according to a neighbor quoted in one of the articles, been a quiet kid who got into the wrong situation. Claire read that phrase, the wrong situation, and felt something complicated move through her. Wrong situations did not arrive fully formed. They were built incrementally by a long sequence of choices that each seemed small at the time. She had no judgment to offer. She had never been 19 and broke and recruited by someone older and harder and more certain about everything. She only knew what she had seen in the moment his finger moved away from the trigger. She had seen a person deciding something, and in that decision, everything that mattered had been possible. She put her phone down. She looked at the business card which she had taken out of her apron and set on the kitchen table at some point during the night without fully realizing she was doing it. You saw the frightened person before you saw the weapon. The man in the dark booth had been afraid of something too. She had seen that clearly enough. Whatever had brought him to a diner at 1:30 in the morning alone was not small. He had been sitting with something that weighed on him the way certain kinds of trouble weigh, not like an object, but like a presence, like a weather system that moved with you wherever you went. She did not know who Julian Moretti was. Not yet. She would learn. In the weeks that followed, she would learn quite a bit. But sitting at her kitchen table at 7 in the morning, with the November light just beginning to gray the edges of the windows, and her hands finally still, she thought about what it meant to see the frightened person first. She thought about Derek, who had built an entire identity out of making sure no one ever saw his fear. She thought about Ray, who had been so afraid that his fear had almost made him into something he was not. She thought about George, pressing his hand to his chest in the booth, afraid with every reason to be afraid, and still politely asking for pie every Wednesday and Saturday, regardless of the weather. She thought about herself, about the 23 minutes in which she had been more frightened than she had been since her father's accident, and about the strange, specific discipline it had taken to let the fear be information instead of instruction. It was not a talent. She wanted to be clear about that, even just to herself, even in the silence of her kitchen. It was not courage in any special sense. It was a choice, the same choice made over and over again in the space of 23 minutes each time fear offered itself as a reason to do something that would make everything worse. You could choose differently. That was all. You could simply choose differently. She put Julian Moretti's card in the drawer of her kitchen table, under a rubber band and an old grocery list, and a photograph of her father from 7 years ago. She made fresh coffee. She sat with it while the light in the window changed from gray to the pale gold of a cold Pittsburgh morning. She did not know sitting there that the robbery was not a random crime. She did not know that the Riverside Diner had been chosen deliberately, that Maria had been targeted specifically, that the chain of cause and effect that had placed Derek and Ray and 6 customers and one unnamed man in that diner at 2:17 in the morning ran deeper and darker than anything she would have been willing to imagine in her kitchen with the morning light and the good coffee. She did not know that Julian Moretti in the back of a car moving toward the North Shore was telling his driver to stop, and then sitting in silence for a long moment, and then saying something very quiet that his driver would not repeat to anyone. She did not know that Ray Tillman in a holding room at the precinct had asked twice if the woman from the diner was all right. She knew what she knew. She had been afraid, and she had chosen 23 minutes of continuous choosing, and at the end of it, everyone in the room was still alive, including a boy who had made a decision she hoped he would be able to build something from. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't everything. It was what she had. She finished her coffee. She rinsed the cup. She went to bed. She did not sleep for 3 hours, but she went to bed. Because that too was a kind of choice, the decision to stop holding yourself up against the weight of what had happened, to allow the night to be over, to put your hands flat on the mattress and breathe. Outside Pittsburgh moved through its morning, the way Pittsburgh always did, with a certain blunt persistence, with the sound of traffic and cold wind and the kind of city noise that never fully went away. The Riverside Diner, 2 miles from where Claire lay in the dark of her bedroom, was closed for the first time in 4 years. Maria had taped a handwritten sign to the door. It said in large letters, "Closed temporarily," and underneath, in smaller writing that most people would not stop to read, "Thank you for your patience." Claire read about the sign later from Sandra's description of it, and she felt something warm and tired and real move through her chest. Maria. Of course, Maria, who had owned the diner for 32 years and who had refused to sell it and who had taped a handwritten sign to the door because the handwritten sign was the most honest way she knew to communicate. Some things were worth protecting. Some people understood that in their bones. The ones who understood it were never the ones who held the weapons. They were the ones who stayed behind the counter, who kept their hands visible, who said, "I'm going to open it, just watch my hands." And sometimes, not always, but sometimes that was enough. The story did not end when the police left. That was the part nobody told you about afterward, about how the real weight of something like that arrived later quietly in the ordinary moments when you were not braced for it. It arrived for Claire on the 3rd morning when she reached across the counter to hand a customer his change, and her hand passed through the exact space where the shotgun barrel had been pressed against her chest, and her entire body simply stopped. Not dramatically, not with shaking or tears. She just stopped for 2 full seconds, completely unable to continue the motion, as though her nervous system had filed a formal objection and refused to withdraw it until she acknowledged the complaint. She acknowledged it. She finished handing over the change. She went to the back and stood over the sink for 60 seconds and breathed. That was how it went. The diner reopened 4 days after the robbery. Maria had cleaned everything herself the morning before, had come in at 5 in the morning, alone without telling anyone, and had wiped down every surface and rearranged the condiment holders on every table and replaced the burned-out bulb in the back booth. When Claire arrived at 6:30, the first thing she noticed was that the dark corner was no longer dark. She stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the light. "I should have done it weeks ago," Maria said from behind her without turning from the coffee maker. "It was on my list." "It's good," Claire said. "Yes," Maria said. "It is." That was all they said about it directly. But it was Claire knew a great deal. Maria had replaced the bulb in the booth where the man with the expensive shoes had sat watching, and neither of them said his name or asked the question that was sitting between them, because some things in a friendship of 11 years did not need to be said directly to be understood completely. The news coverage lasted about a week. A local television reporter called the diner and asked if Claire would be willing to come on the morning show. A true crime podcast reached out through Maria. A newspaper wanted to run a feature. Claire agreed to one interview print, not television, under the condition that they not use the phrase hero waitress and that they allow her to read the piece before it ran. The journalist agreed to both conditions and then used the phrase unlikely hero in the headline, which Claire supposed was close enough that arguing about it would have cost more than it was worth. In the interview, she said that she had been afraid during the entire ordeal. She said it twice because the journalist kept moving past it as though it were a throat clearing, a disclaimer, something to get through before the interesting part. It was not a disclaimer. It was the only part she actually wanted people to understand. "People keep saying you were brave," the journalist said, "or calm." "I was terrified," Claire said. "Those aren't the same thing as brave." "What is brave then?" Claire thought about it for a moment. "Doing the thing you need to do while you're terrified," she finally said, "and not mistaking the fear for instructions." The journalist wrote that down. It ended up being the pull quote. Claire was not sure that was what she had intended, but it was accurate enough that she did not object. 3 weeks after the robbery, she received a phone call from a public defender named Alan Graves. He apologized for calling the diner and said he had tried to reach her through other means first, which she suspected was not entirely true, but chose not to challenge. He represented Ray Tillman. Ray had agreed to testify against Derek Sims in exchange for a reduced sentence and placement in a rehabilitation program, and he had asked his lawyer several times whether it was possible to send a message to the woman from the diner. "I wants to know if you're all right," Alan Graves said. Claire sat down on the stool behind the counter, the one she was not technically supposed to use because it was technically Maria's stool. "Tell him I'm fine," she said. He also, a pause. The careful pause of a man who had rehearsed this and was not sure how it was going to land. "He said that what you told him in the diner was the first time anyone had said something like that to him in years, that he still had a choice." Claire did not say anything for a moment. "He's 19, she said finally. "Yes." "What's he facing?" Alan Graves told her. It was not good, but it was better than it could have been. Derek Sims was facing considerably more. The robbery was part of a pattern, 8 incidents over 14 months, and federal investigators were now involved because several of the targets crossed jurisdictional lines. Ray's testimony was significant. His cooperation would matter. "Does he have family?" Claire asked. "His grandmother. His parents are both. It's complicated." "Okay," she said. "Is there anything you'd like me to tell him?" She thought about Ray standing in the middle of the diner with the shotgun lowered and his hands empty and something human visible in his face through the gap in the mask. She thought about the moment of decision, the actual moment, the hinge of it, when everything that came before pointed in one direction and he chose the other. "Tell him that the second choice matters," she said, "but only if he keeps making them." Alan Graves said he would pass that on. He thanked her. He hung up. Claire sat on Maria's stool for a long time after that. It was Julian Moretti who came back first. He came in on a Tuesday 10 days after the robbery, during the mid-morning lull when the breakfast rush had cleared and the lunch crowd had not yet arrived. He was alone. He wore a different coat equally well cut, and he sat in the same booth, the back booth, the one Maria had finally lit properly, and he ordered black coffee and said please, and he did not look up from the table. Claire poured the coffee. She set it down. She was turning back toward the counter when he said, "I should have introduced myself properly the night of the robbery." She turned back. "You left a card." "I did." "Julian Moretti," she said. He looked up. There was something slightly alert in his expression, the particular alertness of a man who was accustomed to gauging how his name landed on people. "I know who you are," she said. "Not everything, but enough." He held her gaze. Enough to what? Enough to not be impressed, she said. And then because that came out slightly harder than she intended, she added, and enough to be honest with you, which I'm guessing is not something that happens to you very often. Julian looked at her for a long moment. Then something at the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the predecessor of one. No, he said, it isn't. She refilled his coffee, though it didn't need refilling, and she went back to the counter. He stayed for an hour and a half. He did not speak again, and neither did she, and when he left he put a 20 on the table for a $3 cup of coffee and did not wait for change. He came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. By the fourth visit, Claire had stopped pretending she did not know he was studying her. She could feel it in the same way she could feel when any table needed attention, a particular quality of awareness directed in her direction, patient and precise. He was watching how she managed things, not the coffee pouring, not the efficiency of her movements. I was watching how she handled the customer who shouted at her because his eggs were cold, and she calmly pointed out that he had been the one to let them sit for 20 minutes while he finished his phone call. He was watching how she talked down Maria's part-time cook Danny when Danny was about to quit on a Saturday morning because the ventilation system had broken for the third time in a month, and the kitchen had reached a temperature that Claire privately agreed was genuinely unreasonable. I was watching how she talked to the old men at the counter about the Steelers, and to the young mothers about sleep deprivation, and to the delivery driver who ate lunch alone every Thursday, like he was a person worth being interested in, which he was. On the fifth visit, Julian said, "I'd like to offer you a job." Claire was refilling his coffee. She set the pot down on the table rather than carrying it back to the counter, because she wanted her hands free, and she wanted to stand up straight for this conversation. "What kind of job?" she said. "The Moretti Hospitality Group," Julian said. "We own restaurants, commercial warehouses, apartment complexes. 11 properties currently in various stages of redevelopment. We've been having—" He paused. He chose the next word carefully, the way someone chooses a word when they know the honest version of it is more complicated. "Problems between employees, contractors, and the surrounding neighborhoods. Tensions that are starting to become public." "You want me to be a fixer," Claire said. "I want you to be an observer," he said. "Someone who attends meetings, talks to people, identifies problems before they become critical." "Before they become embarrassing," she said. He did not flinch. "Yes, that too." "What you're describing," Claire said, "is using me to make a business with a certain kind of reputation look better than it is." "No." He said it immediately, and there was something in his tone that was different from what she expected, less defensive, more direct. "What I'm describing is a genuine operational problem that no one in my organization has the particular skill to solve. I watched you handle a crisis that would have broken most people. I watched you de-escalate a situation where the primary obstacle to violence was your ability to read two frightened men and communicate with them in the 15 seconds you had available. That is not a decoration. That is a specific capability I do not have and my company needs." It was Claire had to admit a better answer than she had prepared herself for. "The Moretti family," she said. "I read some things." "Yes. Your cousin, Vincent." Something moved in his face at the name. Not much, but something. "Yes." "Are the problems you're describing related to him?" A beat of silence that lasted long enough to be its own answer. "I'm trying to separate the legal operations of this company from elements that should have been separated a long time ago," Julian said. "That is not simple, and it is not fast, and it is not without risk, but it is what I am attempting to do." "And you want my help doing it," Claire said. "I want to hire you," he said. 30-day consulting contract, competitive rate. You work only within the legal operations, and you are not asked to interact with any element that is not." "I have conditions," Claire said. He looked at her. "Tell me." "Everything I do stays completely legal. Not mostly legal. Completely." "Agreed." "I receive all relevant information about any situation I'm being asked to assess. Not the version of it that makes things look better than they are. All of it." He paused on that one. Not long, but she noticed. "Agreed. And if you ever ask me to cross an ethical line, anything I determine to be wrong, I walk. No negotiation, no conversation, no severance package that's meant to make me reconsider. I walk." Julian looked at her for a long time. "Those are reasonable conditions," he said. "They're non-negotiable ones," she said. "I understand the difference," he said. She picked up the coffee pot. She took it back to the counter. She thought about it for 4 days before she called the number on the card. The first week inside the Moretti hospitality group was in some ways more disorienting than the robbery. The robbery had been terrifying but legible. She had understood the structure of it, the logic of the participants, the pressure points. The company was something else. It was 14 floors of glass and polished wood, and people who spoke in a register that reminded her of the journalist who kept trying to move past the uncomfortable parts toward the narrative he had already decided he wanted to write. Julian gave her access to personnel files, complaint logs, contractor communication records, and the notes from 3 rounds of failed mediation between building managers and tenants in 2 of the residential complexes. She read everything. She asked for more. She got it. What she found was not what Julian's senior executives believed she would find. They had prepared, she could tell, for her to identify troublemakers, specific employees or contractors who were causing disruption, individuals who could be managed out of the organization and replaced. That was the model they understood. Problems had sources. You removed the source. The problem resolved. Claire read the records for 10 days and then requested a meeting with Julian. "Your people are not the problem," she said. He looked at her across the table in his office. "Go on." "Your managers are," she said. "Or rather what your managers have been permitted to do. Wage delays of 30 to 45 days on average in 3 properties. Safety complaints filed and not actioned in some cases for 6 to 8 months. At the warehouse on Chartiers Avenue, there have been 4 significant safety incidents in 18 months. 3 people have been hurt. None of the incident reports have resulted in any structural change." She pushed the papers across the table. "The woman who filed the 3rd safety complaint, Rosa Martinez, she's been there 11 years, was moved to a different shift after she filed it. No one told her why. She thinks it was retaliation. Based on the timeline, she's right to think that." Julian looked at the papers. He did not look away. "The employees are not causing conflict," Claire said. "They are responding to conditions that would produce conflict in any functional human being. The managers are not incompetent. They are operating under a culture that has taught them that keeping problems invisible is more important than fixing them, and that culture, Mr. Moretti, was not created by the managers." A long silence. "What do you recommend?" he said. "I recommend that you sit in a room with Rosa Martinez and listen to her," Claire said. "Not HR, not a lawyer, you. And then you do the same with the warehouse supervisor at Chartiers and with the 3 tenants in Northside who have been trying to get someone to look at the mold situation in Building C for 7 months. I know it's not how you usually do things," she said. "I know that's not what you expected when you hired me. But you told me you wanted to know the real problem. That's the real problem. The people inside your buildings and on your payroll have spent years being treated as though their concerns are inconveniences rather than information. You hired me because I can see when someone is about to do something dangerous, because no one has treated them as though they matter. Your employees are there right now, not with weapons, but they are right there." Julian looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Set up the meetings." She set up the meetings. It was not a simple thing. Julian's executive team reacted with reactions that ranged from politely confused to openly hostile. There was a man named Garrett, the head of property operations, who called Claire into his office on the 2nd week and told her in a tone of practiced reasonableness that he was concerned she might be creating disruption through the wrong kind of access and that Julian might benefit from a more experienced consultant. Claire looked at him. She recognized the tone. She had heard that exact tone from customers who wanted to be managed rather than answered, who had built their comfort on never being told anything they did not want to hear. "I appreciate you sharing that with me," she said. "I'll let Julian know you stopped by." Garrett's expression went through 2 changes she found informative. She told Julian about the conversation that afternoon. She told him about it not because she needed his protection, but because she had said in her conditions that she required full information, and full information ran both directions. Julian listened. He did not call Garrett in immediately, which surprised her slightly, but she noticed that at the executive briefing 3 days later, Garrett was seated further from the head of the table than he had been the week before. She filed it as data. The meetings with employees were hard, in the way that honest things were hard, not complicated, just requiring more presence than most people wanted to give. Julian sat across from Rosa Martinez in a conference room on a Thursday afternoon, and Rosa, who had clearly prepared herself to be managed rather than heard, spent the first 8 minutes of the conversation delivering her concerns in the careful formal register of a person who has learned not to trust the room she is sitting in. Julian listened. He did not interrupt. He did not take out his phone. He did not perform engagement. He was actually engaged. And Claire, watching from the side of the room, understood that whatever else Julian Moretti was, he was not incapable of genuine attention. He had simply been in environments for most of his life that had not required it of him. When Rosa finished, Julian said, "The shift change after your complaint. I want you to know that I did not order that, and I want you to know that I'm going to find out who did." Rosa looked at him. The calculation in her expression was not suspicion. It was the specific assessment of a person who has been disappointed before and is deciding whether this moment is different. "What happens then?" she asked. "Then it doesn't happen again," Julian said. "To you or anyone else." "People have said things like that before," Rosa said. "I know," Julian said. "You'll have to watch what I do instead of what I say. I understand that." Rosa looked at Claire. Just for a moment. Claire met her eyes and gave the smallest possible nod, not endorsing Julian, not vouching for him, just acknowledging that Rosa's skepticism was rational, and her presence in this room was courage, regardless of how it turned out. The strike that had been quietly organizing among 3 departments of the property management division did not happen, not because the workers got everything they wanted, they did not, but because for the first time someone in authority had sat in a room with them and let their words land. The wage delay issue was fixed within the month. The safety incidents were investigated, and 3 managers were formally disciplined. Rosa Martinez was moved back to her original shift with a written acknowledgement of error placed in her file. It was not a revolution, but it was real. Claire's initial 30-day contract became 60 days. Julian did not ask her to extend it directly. He asked Maria if she could spare Claire for another month, which Claire found both strategically clever and irritating, and told him so. "You went through Maria," she said. "Maria knows your situation better than I do," he said. "My situation is my situation," she said. "Ask me directly or don't ask." "Will you extend the contract?" he said. "Yes," she said, "but I want the full file on the North Side properties, not the summary, the full file." He sent it to her that evening. She read it over 2 nights, and on the second night, somewhere around midnight, she stopped at a page she had to read 3 times before she was certain she was understanding it correctly. It was a financial report, property acquisition records, the purchase prices and dates for 7 buildings in 2 neighborhoods that bordered the Riverside Diners part of the city. The dates were specific. The purchase prices were specific. And they told a story that she had not been asked to look for and that she now could not unsee. 7 buildings purchased in a 14-month window at prices that were 30 to 40% below their assessed values. The sellers in 5 out of 7 cases had sold under conditions of what the documents described in neutral language as market pressure, which was the kind of language that meant something specific and ugly when you translated it out of the neutral register of financial documentation. She cross-referenced the dates. She pulled the incident reports she had already reviewed for the robbery cases that Derek Sims was now being prosecuted for. The dates aligned, not perfectly, not with the clean, obvious coincidence of something staged, but they aligned in the way that real things aligned messily with the friction of actual events, in a pattern that was unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at. She sat with this for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called a number she had saved from a conversation 2 weeks earlier, not Julian's number, not Maria's number. Detective Lena Brooks answered on the 3rd ring. "I need to ask you something," Claire said, "about the Sims case." A pause, the alert pause of a detective who had just become more interested in a conversation. "What about it?" Lena said. "The buildings," Claire said. "The ones in Banksville and Northside. Is anyone looking at the property records?" A longer pause. "Ms. Morgan," Lena said carefully, "where are you right now?" "My apartment," Claire said. "Are you alone?" "Yes." "Stay there," Lena said. "I'm going to call you back in 10 minutes. She called back in 8. She asked Claire 4 specific questions. Claire answered all 4. There was a silence on the line that had a different quality than the previous silences, heavier, more deliberate. "The records you're describing," Lena said. "You have access to them through your consulting contract." "Yes, and they were provided to you legitimately. You didn't..." Completely legitimately, Claire said. Julian Moretti gave me the full file. I don't think he knew what was in it. Another silence. You don't think, Lena said. And there it was. The exact question Claire had been sitting with since midnight, since the moment the dates aligned on her screen, and the clean professional certainty she had built over the last 60 days had developed its first significant crack. Julian had told her that Vincent was using intimidation before he hired her. He had said he was trying to separate the legal businesses from the old organization. He had been honest about the parts of his family history that were indefensible. But the file had been there. The file with the dates and the purchase prices and the 14-month window had been sitting in the Northside property records the entire time, and Julian Moretti was not a careless man, and Julian Moretti had given her the full file, which meant either he had not read it carefully enough to see what she had seen, or he had not expected her to look at it the way she had looked at it, or he had known exactly what was in it and had handed it to her anyway. She did not know which one it was. And not knowing which one it was meant that the trust she had been carefully building, the 60-day architecture of earned respect between two people who had agreed to be honest with each other, had a question mark at its foundation that she could not ignore. She told Lena she would make copies of the relevant pages available. She did not call Julian that night. She sat at her kitchen table, the same kitchen, the same place she had sat after the robbery, reading about Ray Tillman's age on her phone with the volume off, and she thought about what it meant to be given information by a person who trusted you, and what it meant to be given information by a person who was managing you, and how sometimes at 1 a.m. with the city quiet outside the window, those two things looked identical. She had told Julian that one of her conditions was that she could walk at any ethical line. She had been entirely clear about that. She had meant it entirely. She also knew that walking was a choice, and choices required information, and she did not yet have enough information to know which version of Julian Moretti had handed her the full file. What she knew was this: the Riverside Diner had not been chosen at random. Maria had refused to sell. And whatever was true about Julian's intentions, something connected to his family's network had put a shotgun barrel against her chest at 2:17 on a November morning. She needed to know if he knew. She picked up her phone. She put it back down. She picked it up again. She called Julian at 12:40 in the morning. He answered on the second ring, which meant he had not been asleep, which meant he had been waiting for something, though she could not have said what. The Northside file, she said. The property acquisitions, the 14-month window. A silence. She waited. Claire, he said. Tell me if you knew, she said. Not what you suspected, not what you were afraid might be true. Tell me if you knew. The silence lasted 8 full seconds. She counted them. I suspected, he said finally. Before I hired you, I suspected that Vincent was using pressure around those neighborhoods. I didn't know the full extent. But you suspected? Yes. And you hired me anyway without telling me that. Another silence, different from the first one. Yes, he said. Why? Because I knew you would say no, he said. And I needed you. It was the most honest thing he had said to her in 60 days, and it was, she thought, exactly the kind of honesty that arrived too late to be cleanly forgiven. I need to meet with you tomorrow, she said, in person, in the diner, and I need you to bring everything you know about Vincent's involvement in those acquisitions. Not what you can prove, everything you know. He said he would. She hung up. She sat in the quiet of her kitchen for a long time. The fear was back, not the sharp, immediate fear of a shotgun barrel, but the slower, more corrosive fear of having trusted something that might have been built on a foundation she had not been allowed to inspect. She had told Ray Tillman that leaving without hurting anyone was still a choice. She had told Julian Moretti that crossing an ethical line meant she would walk. Both of those things were still true. Whether they remained true in the morning, whether the morning brought something she could work with, or something she could not stay inside of, would depend on what Julian put on the table when he sat across from her with a cup of coffee in a diner that had been targeted because its owner refused to be afraid. Claire did not sleep that night either, but she was at the Riverside Diner at 6:30, the same as always, with her apron on, and the coffee made and the lights on, because some things you did not walk away from before you had the information to walk away from them, and some things you showed up for even when you were afraid, and there was never a version of courage that looked like leaving before you knew what you were leaving. Julian arrived at 7:15 with a folder under his arm and the expression of a man who understood that what happened in the next hour would determine something that could not be undetermined. She poured the coffee. She sat down across from him. She put her hands flat on the table. "Show me," she said. Julian opened the folder. He did not arrange it or organize it or offer any preamble about what she was about to see. He simply opened it and pushed it across the table toward her, the way a person pushes something across a table when they have decided that the time for controlling information is over, and they are not entirely sure what comes after that decision, but they have made it anyway. Claire looked at the first page, then the second. She did not read quickly. She read the way she had read everything he had given her carefully, with the full attention of someone who understood that what was between the lines of a document was often more important than what was on them. 7 minutes passed. Julian drank his coffee. He did not watch her read. He looked at the table which she noted, and which told her something about the difference between a man performing contrition and a man actually sitting inside it. "Vincent financed the crew," she said. She did not look up from the page. "Yes, Derek Sims worked for Vincent." Not directly. There was a layer between them, a man named Kowalski who ran the street operation. But the money came from Vincent, and the targets came from Vincent, and Kowalski understood what the purpose was. "The purpose being to create fear," Claire said, "around specific neighborhoods, to make people want to leave. To make property owners want to sell," Julian said. "Yes." She turned a page. She stopped. She looked at an address she recognized not because she had read it in any file, but because she had walked past it 4,000 times in 11 years, because it was 2 blocks from where she had grown up, because she knew the shape of the sign above the door, the way she knew the shape of her own handwriting. "The Riverside Diner," she said. Not a question, just the words placed on the table between them, carrying every ounce of what they meant. Julian said nothing. "Maria refused to sell," Claire said. 3 times, Julian said quietly. Vincent approached her through intermediaries. She refused every time. Claire set the page down. She looked at him for the first time since he had opened the folder. "The robbery was not random," she said. "No. I was working there that night because Maria asked me to cover a shift for Danny, who had a family emergency. I was in that diner because of a scheduling change that happened 4 hours before the robbery. I know. Which means Vincent's people chose that night for reasons that had nothing to do with me specifically. Yes. But they chose that diner," she said. "They chose Maria's diner. They sent 2 armed men into a place where people were eating breakfast food at 2 in the morning because Maria would not sell a building that her mother opened in 1987. Julian put his coffee cup down. He did it carefully without any sound. "Yes," he said. The silence that followed was not the silence of 2 people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of one person absorbing the full weight of something that the other person had known was coming and had not been able to figure out how to prevent, not the event itself, but this moment, this table, this specific accounting. "You knew," Claire said, "before you hired me. You suspected that Vincent was behind a campaign of targeted intimidation that included the diner where I worked." "I suspected the campaign," Julian said. "I did not know the specific targets until later." "When did you know the diner was one of them?" He did not answer immediately. The pause was small, 2 seconds, maybe 3, but Claire had spent 60 days learning the texture of Julian Moretti's silences, and this one had a particular quality that she recognized. "Before or after you hired me," she said. Another pause. "After," he said. 3 weeks after." 3 weeks after," she repeated. "Which means for the last 5 weeks you have known that the place where I was standing when a gun was pressed against my chest was a deliberate target of your cousin's operation, and you did not tell me." "I was trying to find a way to—" "No," she said. It was quiet. It was not a shout. It was the kind of no that carried more weight than a shout, because it arrived without any performance attached to it. "Do not finish that sentence with anything that is not the truth." Julian looked at her. He looked at her the way people looked at something they had broken, not with anger at the thing, but with the specific particular weight of knowing that the breaking was their own doing. "I was afraid you would leave," he said, "and I needed you to stay." "You needed me to stay," she said. "The work you were doing, what you were finding, what you were changing inside the company, it was the first real evidence I had that the separation was possible, that the legitimate business could exist without the other structure underneath it. I was afraid that if I told you the full context, you would walk, and I would lose the only thing that was actually working." Claire looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her coffee. She took a sip. She set it down. "You use the same logic Vincent uses," she said. Julian went very still. "The ends justify the silence," she said. "The goal is important enough that the person who might object doesn't get all the information. You did not send men into a diner with weapons, but you withheld the truth from a person who had told you as a condition of her work that she required the truth. And the reason you withheld it was control. You wanted to control the outcome." Julian did not deny it. That she would think about later was perhaps the thing that mattered most in that moment, not the apology, not the explanation, but the fact that he did not construct a defense. "What do you want to do with what's in the folder?" he said. "I already called Detective Brooks," Claire said. He looked at her. "Last night," she said, "after I found the acquisition records. I didn't give her the folder because I didn't have it, but I described what I had found, and she is already looking at the property records through official channels." She paused. "She's going to find it with or without us. The question is whether you cooperate or you don't." "If I cooperate," Julian said, "Vincent finds out. And Vincent's response to people who cooperate with law enforcement is not administrative." "I know that," Claire said. "It's not just me," he said. "There are people inside my organization who have cooperated with me, managers who changed, employees who trusted the process. If Vincent decides to retaliate—" "I know," Claire said again. Her voice had not changed. "I know all of that, and I'm telling you that you need to cooperate anyway, because the alternative is that you spend the rest of your life being the person who knew and didn't say, and that is not a life you will be able to hold together, and somewhere inside you, you already understand that." Julian looked out the window. The Pittsburgh morning was doing what Pittsburgh mornings in November did, gray, and determined the kind of weather that did not apologize for itself. "Give me a week," he said. "You have until Vincent moves first," Claire said, "which based on what I've read in that folder may not be a week away." She was right. It was 4 days. On the first day, Claire went to the diner in the morning and to Julian's offices in the afternoon and said nothing to either Maria or any of her colleagues about what she knew, because she had determined that the most dangerous thing at that moment was information circulating before the people who needed to act on it were in a position to do so. This was one of the lonelier decisions she had made in the entire sequence of lonely decisions that the last 2 months had required of her. On the second day, Detective Lena Brooks called and confirmed that the property acquisition pattern had been flagged by federal investigators who had been building a parallel case on Derek Sims's robbery network. They had pieces. Claire's information connected pieces they had not known were connected. Lena's voice had a particular quality that Claire associated with detectives who were looking at something larger than they had anticipated and were recalculating in real time. "How close are you to Julian Moretti?" Lena asked. "Close enough to know that he is going to cooperate," Claire said, "if you give him a structured pathway to do it." "That's not my call," Lena said. "I know," Claire said. "Whose call is it?" Lena gave her a name. A federal prosecutor named Diane Walsh, who was handling the financial crimes component of the Sims case, and who had, according to Lena, been looking at Moretti-adjacent connections for considerably longer than anyone had publicly acknowledged. "I can make an introduction," Lena said carefully. "Make it," Claire said. On the third day, Julian met with Diane Walsh in an office on Liberty Avenue that had the specific institutional neutrality of a space designed to make everyone in it equally uncomfortable. Claire was not in the room. She was in the waiting area outside it, sitting in a plastic chair with a coffee from the machine that tasted like it had been made in the previous administration, and reading a 3-month-old magazine she was not actually reading, because what she was actually doing was staying close enough to be available and far enough away to be telling the truth when she said later that she had not been in the room. Julian came out after 2 hours. He looked like a man who had put down something he had been carrying for a very long time and was discovering that the absence of the weight did not feel the way he had imagined it would feel. "Okay," he said. "Okay what?" she said. "I told her everything." Claire let out a breath. "Good." "She wants more," he said. "She wants Vincent directly. The property scheme is enough for a significant case, but she wants the connection between him and the robbery network documented in a way that will hold in federal court. That's going to take— She wants a meeting," Julian said, "with Vincent, something that can be monitored." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Does Vincent know yet that you've been talking to federal investigators?" "No." "How long before he finds out?" 48 hours, Julian said. "Maybe 72. He has people inside the building where we just met." "Then the meeting needs to happen before then," Claire said. "That's what Diane Walsh said." "Can you arrange it?" Julian looked at her. "Vincent will only agree to a meeting if I come with someone he doesn't perceive as a threat. Someone he thinks is my—" He stopped. He chose the next word with visible care. "Weakness." The word landed in the air between them, and they both looked at it. "He thinks I'm your weakness," Claire said. "He thinks you've made me soft," Julian said. "He's been saying it to the people around him for 6 weeks. He believes that your influence on the company is evidence that I'm no longer capable of making hard decisions." "And he wants to see that for himself," Claire said. "I wants to use it," Julian said. "He thinks if he can get me in a room with you present, he can pressure me into surrendering operational control of the legitimate businesses. He thinks your presence will make me easier to threaten," Claire said. "Yes." She thought about this for a moment. She thought about what it meant that Vincent Moretti, who had never met her, had built an entire theory of her based on the assumption that she was a liability, that the thing she had done in the diner, the thing that had genuinely stunned Julian and that had changed the trajectory of everything that followed, was actually evidence of weakness dressed up as strength. It was, she thought, a profoundly stupid mistake. But it was also the kind of mistake that powerful men made with some regularity, and the fact that it was a mistake did not make it less dangerous. "Set up the meeting," she said. Julian looked at her carefully. "I want to be clear about what this is," he said. "Vincent is not Derek Sims. He is not a nervous young man with a shotgun he barely knows how to hold. He is—" "I know what he is," Claire said. "Set up the meeting." The call to arrange the meeting went through 3 intermediaries and took 6 hours and involved a level of negotiation that Claire was not party to and did not ask about in detail. What she knew was that on the evening of the 4th day, she and Julian were in the back of a car moving toward the north side, toward an address that had been a Moretti-owned restaurant until 8 months ago and had been closed since then, and the inside of the car was very quiet. "If this goes wrong," Julian said. "It won't," Claire said. "Claire." "Let me think," she said, not unkindly, just directly. She needed to think, and she needed him to let her do it, and he understood that, and he was quiet. She thought about the structure of what was coming. She thought about what she knew about Vincent from the documents, and from Julian's descriptions, and from the particular way that people spoke about him, not with the specific fear they used for Julian, but with a different kind of fear, the kind that had no admiration mixed into it, the kind that was purely about unpredictability and the specific pleasure certain people took in demonstrating that they operated outside the normal consequences of things. She thought about Derek Sims in the diner, the practiced quality of his control, the way he had built his authority entirely on other people's panic, the way her refusal to panic had disoriented him more thoroughly than any direct challenge could have. Vincent was more sophisticated than Derek. He had more resources and more options and considerably more experience. But the fundamental architecture was the same power built on fear, required fear to function. And a person who refused to be governed by fear was not just a personal inconvenience. They were a structural threat to the entire system. That was what she had. That was what she was walking in with. She also had something else. She reached into her bag and made sure it was still there, the folded copies of the financial documents, the acquisition records, the communication logs between Vincent's intermediaries and Kowalski's operation. Diane Walsh had the originals. Claire had copies because Claire had decided 4 hours ago that she was not going into this room without something concrete in her hands, and Diane Walsh, after a silence that communicated something between admiration and professional exasperation, had agreed. The restaurant was dark inside, except for lights in the back room. There were 2 men at the entrance who did not introduce themselves and who looked at Claire with the particular blank appraisal of people who had been told she was coming and had formed an opinion about what she represented before she arrived. Julian walked in ahead of her. She followed. She kept her breathing even and her hands loose at her sides, and she noticed everything: the 2 men by the door, the configuration of the room, the 4 men standing along the back wall in the arrangement of people who had been placed rather than gathered, and the man sitting at the table in the center of it all. Vincent Moretti was 53 years old and looked like someone had assembled him from raw materials intended to communicate authority, broad-shouldered, heavy-browed, with the kind of physical stillness that in certain men signaled danger, and in certain other men was simply the habit of a person who had learned that stillness communicated more than movement. He was looking at Julian when they walked in, but his eyes moved to Claire within the first 2 seconds, and they stayed there for longer than was polite, which she understood was intentional. "This is her," Vincent said, not to Julian, just aloud the way someone might read a label on something that they were considering purchasing. "Her name is Claire Morgan," Julian said. "I know what her name is," Vincent said. He had not stopped looking at her. "Sit down, Julian." Julian did not sit. Claire noticed that the smallest possible act of resistance, barely distinguishable from simple stillness, but present. "We're fine standing," Julian said. Vincent's eyes moved to Julian for the first time since they had walked in. Something in his expression shifted not much, but Claire catalogued it. He had expected a different version of Julian. The version of Julian he had been hearing about, the managed one, the softened one. The Julian who had been spending his evenings at a diner listening to a waitress tell him about his own company. He had not expected this Julian, the one who was standing. "All right," Vincent said. He leaned back. He moved his gaze back to Claire. "So you're the one who's been redecorating my cousin's business instincts." "I've been consulting on operational efficiency," Claire said, "reducing conflict, improving communication." That's a lovely way to describe getting Julian to fire 3 of his best managers and sit in rooms with housekeeping staff. His best managers were creating liability, Claire said, and the housekeeping staff had information that was costing the company money. Good decisions require good information. That's not ideology, it's arithmetic. Vincent looked at her the way people looked at something they had dismissed and were now performing the act of reconsidering. It was not genuine reconsideration, she knew that. It was a performance of it meant to convey that she had mildly surprised him before he returned to his original assessment. "Julian," Vincent said, "I want to talk about the North Side properties." "I thought you might," Julian said. "The redevelopment timeline is behind. I have investors who are not patient people. The original acquisition strategy was a criminal conspiracy," Julian said. The room changed. Not dramatically, the men along the back wall did not move. Vincent did not stand, but there was a shift, a tightening, the particular atmospheric change of a space in which something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Vincent looked at his cousin. "Excuse me." "The property acquisition strategy was a criminal conspiracy," Julian said. His voice was not loud. It was very, very steady. "You financed a robbery network. You used deliberately created fear to depress property values in targeted neighborhoods. You sent 2 armed men into a diner owned by a woman who had refused to sell in the middle of the night with customers inside." "Julian," Vincent said, and the word had a particular weight under it, a reminder, a reference to every piece of information that Vincent held about every choice Julian had made over the course of his life. "I'm done," Julian said. "I'm done with this conversation, and I'm done with the structure you built, and I'm done pretending that separating it was something I could accomplish quietly from the inside." Vincent turned to look at Claire. The performance of careful reconsideration was gone now. What was under it was not panic. Vincent Moretti did not panic, but it was something adjacent, the rapid recalculation of a man who has walked into a situation with a set of assumptions and discovered that the assumptions are wrong. "You," he said to Claire, "you think because you kept your hands steady in a diner that you understand what this is." "No," Claire said. "I think I understand that you need everyone in this room to be afraid of you for this conversation to go the way you planned it." Silence. "And I'm going to tell you what I told someone else in a different room a few months ago," she said. "Fear and surrender are not the same thing." She reached into her bag. She took out the folded pages. She put them on the table. "Those are copies," she said. "The originals are with federal investigators who have been building this case for considerably longer than you know. The property records, the acquisition communications, the financial transfers between your accounts, and Kowalski's operation. All of it. It has already been delivered." She paused. "Last night." Vincent looked at the papers. He did not reach for them. "You're bluffing," he said. "Then don't do anything differently," Claire said. "If I'm bluffing, it costs you nothing to call it." A long silence. Somewhere outside, a car passed. The sound came through the walls and then faded, and in the space after it faded, the room felt very small and very specific, the way rooms felt when the thing happening in them was the only thing happening anywhere. "You think you've won something," Vincent said. He was still looking at Claire. He had not looked at Julian since the moment Julian said the word conspiracy. "You think this is a movie. Good woman, bad man. Everything gets cleaned up." "No," Claire said. "I think you're going to be arrested. And I think the people who work in the buildings you've been manipulating are going to have a better year than last year. And I think a 19-year-old kid is going to get a chance he wouldn't have gotten otherwise. None of that is a movie. It's just what happens when people stop letting fear tell them what to do." Vincent stood up. It was not explosive. He rose steadily, deliberately, in the manner of a man who had decided to demonstrate that he was still the one choosing how events proceeded. He looked at Julian. "If you do this," he said, "you lose everything. The family, the business, the name." "I know," Julian said. "You'll have nothing left." "I'll have less than I have now," Julian said. "That's different from nothing." Vincent looked at his cousin for a long moment, a look that had years inside it, the entire accumulated history of two men who had grown up inside the same name and made profoundly different choices about what that name required of them, and then he turned to the men along the back wall. Claire watched them. She had been watching them for the last 8 minutes the way she had watched Ray Tillman for the last 8 minutes of the robbery, cataloging the small movements, the shifts in weight, the tiny signals that indicated the distance between what a person had been told to do and what they were actually willing to do when the moment arrived. 3 of the 4 men had been told the meeting would be peaceful. She could read it in the way they were standing, prepared for tension, not for action. Only the one closest to the door had the posture of someone who had been given a different set of instructions. She looked at him directly, not challenging, just clearly. The same direct human look she had given Ray across the counter in the diner. He looked back. His posture shifted, not dramatically, not enough that anyone else would have noticed. "Tell him to lower it," Claire said quietly. Julian turned. He saw it, the hand moving the jacket, the beginning of something that was not supposed to be happening in a room where a federal monitoring team was 3 minutes away. "Marco," Julian said. "Don't." Marco looked at Vincent. Vincent said nothing, and his silence was its own instruction. "Marco," Julian said again, "federal investigators know we are in this building right now. Whatever happens in this room in the next 60 seconds will be on record. Think about that." Marco looked at Claire again. She had not moved. She had not stepped back or changed her posture or shown him anything he could use as justification. He lowered his hand. Vincent turned to look at him, and whatever he saw in Marco's face, the same thing Claire had seen, the same calculation about consequences and culpability, and the specific moment when a person decides they are not willing to be responsible for a thing, told him that the room had changed in a way he could not reverse from where he was standing. The door opened. It opened from the outside with the specific controlled urgency of people who had been listening and had determined that this was the moment. Detective Lena Brooks came in first, 2 federal agents behind her, 2 more through a second entrance that Claire had noted when they arrived and had assumed would be used if things developed the way they were developing. Vincent looked at Julian. He had looked at him 3 times in the last hour, and each time the look had been different. Disbelief first, then warning, then the specific expression of a man, understanding that the person he was looking at had in some fundamental and irreversible way become someone other than who he had assumed. "You'll regret this," Vincent said. "Probably some of it," Julian said. "Not this." Lena moved past them both and said something to Vincent that was crisp and official, and that Claire did not fully hear because she had taken 2 steps back toward the wall and was breathing slowly and letting her hands hang at her sides, and she was doing the same thing she had done in the diner in the 23 minutes of continuous choosing. She was letting the fear be present, letting it tell her everything it knew, and then letting the moment be over. It was over. Not everything was over. She understood clearly enough that the next months would carry their own weight, their own complications, their own versions of the conversation she had just had. But this specific thing, this room, this confrontation, this decision that Vincent had forced and Julian had made and she had helped to make possible, this was over. Marco was sitting against the wall with his hands visible, and his expression was the expression of a man who had come within 30 seconds of a different life and knew it, and had not decided yet how he felt about the version of the night that had actually happened. Claire looked at him. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say. He was alive, and the room was full of federal agents, and the papers on the table had already told the story that mattered, and sometimes that was all the resolution. There was not clean, not simple, but real. She walked to where Julian was standing. He was watching the agents, with Vincent watching with an expression that was not satisfaction and not grief, but something between them, the particular expression of a person who has done a necessary thing and is only beginning to understand what necessary things cost. "You okay?" she said. He looked at her. "No," he said. "That's the right answer," she said. He almost smiled at that. Almost. She picked up the papers from the table because she thought someone should, and she folded them, and she put them back in her bag. Outside, she could hear more vehicles arriving, the sounds of the city assembling itself around a moment that would matter, that would be written about and testified about and argued about in rooms she would never see. She thought about Maria. She thought about Maria's handwritten sign taped to the door, closed temporarily, and about the 32 years of refusing to sell, and about the weight of a building that had been her mother's, and that someone had decided to take from her through fear. She thought about what Maria would say tomorrow morning when Claire called her, and about the fact that she did not know yet what to say, only that she would find the right words in the way she always found them, slowly, honestly, without any attempt to make the truth sound better than it was. She thought about Ray Tillman, 19 years old. In a rehabilitation program, he had not yet entered, carrying a second choice he had not yet figured out how to build from. She thought about the business card in her kitchen drawer beneath the rubber band and the grocery list and the photograph of her father. You saw the frightened person before you saw the weapon. She was still seeing them, all of them. Derek, who had never let himself be seen. Vincent, who had built an empire on ensuring he was never vulnerable. Marco, who had moved his hand at the last possible moment. Julian, who was standing beside her in an abandoned restaurant, watching the architecture of his family's power come apart and refusing to pretend it was not happening. They were all frightened, every single one of them. Fear was the most common thing in any room, in any confrontation, in any moment that mattered. The question was never whether it was present. The question was what you let it tell you and what you refused to let it decide. She walked out ahead of the others into the Pittsburgh night, into the cold air that smelled like November and the river, and she stood on the sidewalk, and she breathed. Her hands were not shaking this time. They had done their shaking earlier privately in the car, while Julian was looking out the window and not asking her if she was all right, because somehow he had known she did not need the question, she needed the space. She stood on the sidewalk. She breathed. Above her, the city made its ordinary sounds, traffic and distance, and the specific hum of a place that continued, regardless of what happened inside any particular building within it. It was not over. She knew that clearly. The morning would bring its own weight, and the day after that, and the months that followed, would ask things of her she could not yet anticipate. There would be testimony and headlines and conversations she was dreading, and conversations she had not yet imagined needing to have. But this night, this specific concrete night, had gone the way she had needed it to go. Not because she was fearless, not because she was extraordinary, because she had walked into a room with the truth in her hands and refused to let fear decide what happened next. That was enough. That had always been enough. The arrests made the morning news. By 7:15, Claire's phone had received 14 messages, and she had read none of them. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her, reading the online coverage the same way she had read about Ray Tillman's age on the night of the robbery, carefully, with the volume of everything turned down, as though the information might be more manageable if she received it quietly. It was not more manageable. The headline on the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette's website read, "Moretti cousin arrested in federal property fraud case. Julian Moretti cooperates with investigators." Below it, a photograph of the abandoned restaurant taken sometime in the middle of the night, its exterior lit by the kind of artificial police lighting that made everything look both more and less real than it actually was. She scrolled down. The third paragraph mentioned her name. Not by name at first, a consultant working within the Moretti Hospitality Group. But the fourth paragraph corrected that and identified her fully, and the fifth paragraph described her as the same Claire Morgan who gained local attention in November following a robbery at the Riverside Diner on Banksville Road. She put the phone face down on the table. She picked it up again 30 seconds later because she could not stop herself, and she read the comments section, which she knew she should not do, and which confirmed every reason she should not have done it. The first wave of comments divided almost perfectly into two camps, each of which got something fundamentally wrong. One camp said she was a hero who had taken down the mob. The other said she was a criminal who had spent 3 months embedded in an organized crime operation and should be investigated. The second camp was smaller but considerably louder, and several of the comments mentioned her by name in ways that she would spend the next several weeks trying not to think about in the middle of the night. She closed the browser. She called Maria. Maria answered on the first ring, which meant she had been awake and waiting, which meant Maria had already read the coverage and had already formed her opinion and was waiting to see what Claire needed before she offered it. "You saw the news," Claire said. "I've been watching since 5:30, Maria said. "How are you doing?" A pause that was its own answer. The pause of a woman who had spent 32 years refusing to sell a building and had now learned the full cost of what that refusal had almost brought down on the people inside it. "Angry," Maria said finally. "Relieved. Angry again." "That sounds right," Claire said. "They sent men in here," Maria said, "into my diner, with guns, because I wouldn't sign a piece of paper." Her voice had a quality in it that Claire had never heard before. Not grief, not rage, but the particular sound of a person processing the gap between what they knew had happened and what it now meant to know why it happened. "My mother opened that place in '87. "I know," Claire said. "She worked 6 days a week for 11 years to pay off the loan. She mopped that floor herself until she was 73 years old." A breath. "And someone decided it was worth terrorizing her customers to get his hands on it." "He's in custody," Claire said. "I know he is," Maria said. "I'm still angry." "You should be," Claire said. Being angry is the correct response. A silence between them, the comfortable kind, the kind that 11 years of friendship produces, where the absence of words is not a gap, but a form of presence. "Claire," Maria said. "Yeah, you did the right thing. I know. Are you okay?" She thought about it honestly, the way Maria's questions always required honesty, because Maria could tell when you were giving her the version of yourself you thought she wanted to hear, rather than the actual version. "Not entirely," she said, "but I will be." "Come in at 10, Maria said. "I'll make the good coffee." The good coffee meant the beans Maria ordered from a small roaster in the Strip District and ground herself every morning, the ones she kept for the days that required something better than ordinary. It was an offer that said more than it said. 10, Claire agreed. She hung up and sat for another 20 minutes with the cold coffee and the turned-over phone before she showered and got dressed and went out into the Pittsburgh morning, which was doing what it always did, continuing indifferent with the blunt persistence of a city that had seen harder things than this and would see harder things again. By 10 o'clock, the diner had 3 people in it who were not there for the coffee. 2 of them Claire identified immediately as journalists. The specific combination of practiced casualness and strategic positioning that she had learned to recognize during the week after the robbery. They were sitting at separate tables, which told her they were not together, which meant at least 2 different outlets had sent someone. The third person she did not identify immediately, and it was only when Maria leaned across the counter and said quietly, "The woman in the corner has been here since before I opened. She's a blogger. She has 400,000 followers," that Claire understood the shape of the morning she was walking into. She did not talk to any of them. She put on her apron and she poured coffee for the regular customers, and she said, when each journalist approached, that she was not giving statements at this time, and that any media inquiry could go through the number the federal prosecutor's office had provided. This was a number that Diane Walsh had given her 2 days ago with the specific instruction to use it exactly this way, which Claire appreciated more now than she had when it was given. The blogger was harder. She was younger than Claire, mid-20s, with the particular energy of a person who genuinely believed that the story she was telling was important and had not yet fully separated that belief from her desire for the story to be important. "I just want 5 minutes," she said. "Not for a hit piece. I think what you did was extraordinary. I want people to know the real version." "The real version is complicated," Claire said. "That's why I want to talk to you," the blogger said. "The complicated version." Claire looked at her. She was not insincere. Claire could read insincerity the way she could read a room as data clear and specific, and this young woman was not performing interest. She was actually interested. That made her harder to dismiss and not easier to trust. "Here's the real version," Claire said. "I'm a woman who spent 60 days inside an organization I knew was complicated because I thought I could do genuine good. And I did some genuine good. And I also got played partly by a man who withheld information because he was afraid of what I'd do with it. And I made decisions that I think were right and that had consequences I couldn't fully control. That's it. That's the story. Nothing about it is extraordinary. It's just what happens when regular people get put in irregular situations and try to do the right thing without a script. The blogger stared at her. "Can I quote you on that?" "No," Claire said. "But you can think about it. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of the entire sequence, harder in some ways than the robbery itself, because the robbery had been contained a single night with a clear architecture of events, while the aftermath of the arrests spread in every direction simultaneously and had no clear endpoint. The federal case against Vincent Moretti and Derek Sims moved quickly because the evidence was substantial and the cooperation was genuine. And Diane Walsh was the kind of federal prosecutor who had been waiting for this specific configuration of evidence for longer than she would say publicly. Ray Tillman's expanded testimony connected the robbery network to the property scheme in 3 locations, which added counts to Derek's charges and transformed the case from a local robbery pattern into a federal conspiracy. Julian cooperated fully. This was not a surprise to Claire. She had watched him decide to do. It had been in the room when he said he had told Diane Walsh everything, but the extent of the cooperation and the speed with which he delivered additional documentation on the broader financial structure was something she had not fully anticipated. The Moretti Hospitality Group's accounts were frozen pending audit. 6 properties were placed under federal supervision. 3 pending development contracts were suspended. The partners who had been doing business with the Moretti name began their exit quietly at first, and then less quietly, with a specific urgency of people removing themselves from a situation before the situation defined them. Julian lost a significant portion of his business infrastructure in approximately 10 days. He did not call Claire during those 10 days. She noticed that. She was not sure yet what she thought about it. On the 11th day, she received a call from a number she did not recognize, and it turned out to be a journalist from a national publication who had been given her number through a source she could not identify and who wanted her response to an article that was running the following morning. "What article?" she said. The journalist described it. It was not primarily about the arrests. It was about Claire, about her role in the investigation, about her consulting contract with the Moretti organization. About the question posed as a question, the journalist emphasized, not as an accusation of whether a person who had been embedded in a company with known criminal affiliations for 60 days had in some meaningful sense been complicit in that company's operations. Claire sat with the phone against her ear for a long moment. "Do you have any comment on that question?" the journalist asked. "I think," she said carefully, "that the question of complicity is worth asking about everyone who has information about wrongdoing and delays in acting on it. I think that question applies to me, and it applies to Julian Moretti, and it applies to however many people inside various institutions had pieces of this picture and held them separately rather than putting them together. I don't exempt myself from that question. I also don't accept the version of the answer that says I was running a criminal operation." She paused. "Write what you think is true. That's all any of us can do." "Yeah." The journalist said he appreciated her candor. She did not find this comforting. The article ran. It was more balanced than she had feared, and more prominent than she had hoped, appearing in the weekend edition, with her photograph taken years earlier. She had no idea how they found it above the fold. The online version accumulated comments with the speed that things accumulated comments when they touched the particular intersection of crime and gender and class that this story had arrived at. The comments were worse than the ones on the local coverage. Not all of them, a significant number, were thoughtful, or at least attempted thoughtfulness. But the ones that weren't were very specifically not. Several accused her of being manipulated. Several accused her of manipulating Julian. One thread, which she read once and then closed and did not return to, had decided that the most interesting interpretation of everything was that she had been romantically involved with Julian from the beginning, and that the entire investigation was a staged performance of some kind, the purpose of which the thread's participants could not quite agree on, but were confident was sinister. She called her father that night. Frank Morgan had been a dispatcher for Pittsburgh Emergency Services for 22 years and had the particular quality of composure that came from 2 decades of managing crisis at one step, removed the person on the other end of the line when things went wrong, the voice that organized the response. He had retired 4 years ago and now lived in a house in Mont Lebanon with a garden he claimed was for relaxation and a police scanner he claimed was just habit. "I read the article," he said when he answered. "How bad is it?" "It's not bad," he said. "It's complicated, which is different. Some people think I was working for organized crime." "Some people think a lot of things," Frank said. "What do you think?" She had not expected the question, which was foolish because her father always asked the question that turned the attention back to the person who needed to answer it. It was the thing about him that had driven her crazy as a teenager, and that she had come over the years to understand was the thing she valued most. "I think I did some genuine good," she said. "I think I was used partly. I think I found out I was used and I chose to stay and try to fix it rather than walk away. I think that was the right call. I also think that there are people sitting in their apartments reading that article right now who are going to decide I was naive or complicit or both, and some of them are going to say it loudly, and I cannot control that." "No," Frank said. "You can't." "I keep thinking about what I could have done differently," she said. "Whether there was a version of this where I asked better questions earlier, where I pushed harder for information on the front end instead of finding it in the middle." "Probably," Frank said. "But the version of this where you don't take the job, what does that look like? Vincent still running his operation, Maria still at risk, those employees at the warehouse still getting hurt with no one listening." She was quiet. "You're not responsible for fixing every problem perfectly," Frank said. "You're responsible for doing the best you can with what you know when you know it. That's all anybody gets." She talked to her father for 40 minutes. When she hung up, she felt something that was not quite better, but was more organized, the specific clarity that came from speaking honestly with someone who knew the actual shape of you, rather than the version of you that had appeared in a newspaper. She went to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time in weeks. She was awoken at 6:15 the following morning by a text from an unknown number. The text said, "I owe you an apology that I don't know how to give correctly. I'm going to try anyway. Would you meet me?" She knew who it was before she even checked the contact. She knew from the sentence construction, the precision of it, the particular way of acknowledging inadequacy that refused to dress it up in the same way she had known things about people from how they held a coffee cup or moved their hands when they thought no one was paying attention. She put the phone on the nightstand. She lay there for several minutes looking at the ceiling. Then she picked up the phone and typed, "The diner, tomorrow at 8. She sent it before she had fully decided to. Then she lay back and looked at the ceiling again and thought about the decision she had just made and whether it was the right one, and decided that she would not be able to know the answer to that until considerably later, which was a thing that was true about most of the decisions that mattered. Julian was there at 7:50. She knew this because Maria texted her at 7:51 to say he had arrived, that he had ordered black coffee and said please, and that he looked in Maria's assessment like a man who had not slept properly in 2 weeks. Claire walked in at 8 exactly. Howe was in the back booth. Maria had given him the back booth, the one she had finally lit properly, and the symbolism of that, intentional or not with Maria, it was often both, was not lost on Claire as she crossed the diner and sat down across from him. He looked worse than the last time she had seen him. Not physically damaged. Physically he was the same, the expensive coat, the careful stillness. But the thing he had been carrying in his eyes on the night of the robbery, the specific heaviness of a man sitting inside a problem he didn't know how to solve, was different now. It had been replaced by something that was not lighter, but was more honest. The heaviness of a man who had solved the problem and was now living in the solution and discovering what the solution actually cost. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You said you owed me an apology," she said. "I wanted to hear it." He looked at her. "I withheld information because I was afraid of what you'd do with it," he said. "I knew that you had told me as a condition of your involvement that you required full information. I agreed to that condition, and then I violated it. I violated it not because I thought you couldn't handle the truth, but because I knew you would make the right decision with it, and the right decision was one I wasn't ready for." She listened. She did not interrupt. "I told myself that I needed more time," he said, "that I was protecting the progress that was being made, that the employees who were benefiting from the changes deserved the stability of the situation continuing. Every one of those things was true, and none of them were the real reason. The real reason was that I needed you to stay, and I chose to make that decision for you instead of giving you the information that was yours to have." A silence. "That's the same logic as the people you were trying to separate yourself from," Claire said. "Yes," he said. "I know. Withholding information from people who deserve it because you've decided the outcome matters more than their agency. That is not a Moretti family trait. That is a human trait. But it is one with specific consequences when the person doing it has power. I know, he said again. Do you? He looked at her directly. I'm beginning to, he said. I think understanding it completely is going to take longer than this conversation. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the conversation she'd had with Ray Tillman's attorney. The second choice matters only if he keeps making them. She had said those words about a 19-year-old boy who had lowered a shotgun in a diner. She had not imagined at the time that she would be applying the same principle to a 50-year-old man sitting across from her in the same diner 3 months later. But that was the thing about principles. They did not select for age or background or the amount of damage a person had done before they arrived at the moment of decision. They simply applied, consistently without exception, to everyone who showed up at the hinge. I'm not going to tell you it's okay, she said, because it isn't. I know. And I'm not going to tell you that I trust you the same way I trusted you before I found out, because I don't. I know that too. What I will tell you, she said, is that trust can be rebuilt. It takes a long time. It requires consistent action, not dramatic promises. It requires you to make different choices than the ones you made over and over again in situations where it would be easier and more comfortable to make the old ones. Julian looked at her. Something in his expression was very still and very careful, the expression of a person receiving information they had hoped for and are afraid to trust. Is that something you're willing to see? He said. It's something I'm willing to watch, she said. Whether it goes anywhere depends on what I see. He nodded. He did not push further than that. He understood, she thought, or was beginning to understand, that this was not a negotiation where additional effort could accelerate the timeline. You could not charm your way through an accountability process. You could only be accountable and let time do what time did. The legal consequences arrived in stages over the following 6 weeks. Julian appeared before a federal judge and gave testimony about the operations of the Moretti organization with a specificity and a cooperativeness that Diane Walsh would later describe in a statement to the press as exceptional. He was given a structured agreement, not immunity, which was not available given the extent of his knowledge, but a significantly reduced exposure in exchange for his cooperation. He pulled guilty to 2 counts. He paid fines that were substantial enough to require liquidating several personal assets. He agreed to 4 years of supervised release and ongoing cooperation with the continuing federal investigation into the remaining elements of the network. He placed the 6 Moretti Hospitality Group properties that had not been frozen under independent management oversight, a board that included a federal-appointed monitor, 2 community representatives from the affected neighborhoods, and a legal representative for the employees. He had no seat on that board. He had no vote on any decision it made. He had constructed this arrangement himself before it was required of him, which was the kind of detail that Diane Walsh noticed and which Claire learned about 3 weeks after the fact through a conversation with Lena Brooks rather than from Julian directly. He had not told her, not because he was hiding it. He simply had not seen it as something he had earned the right to announce. She thought about that for a long time when she learned it. He also established a compensation fund drawn from personal assets rather than from the company accounts that were now under federal supervision. The fund was administered by a community development organization based in Northside and covered losses sustained by residents and small business owners who had been directly affected by the property acquisition scheme. Maria's Diner was on the list of affected properties. Maria called Claire the afternoon she received the letter from the fund administrator. She said, "There's a check." Claire said, "I know." "It's not small," Maria said. "No." A pause. "I don't know how to feel about it," Maria said. "You can feel more than one thing," Claire said. "You can think the money is right and still be angry that the situation required it. You can accept it and not let it be the end of the story. My mother would have accepted it," Maria said. "She would have said something in Polish that I won't repeat, and then she would have deposited the check." "That sounds like a plan," Claire said. Maria made a sound that was approximately halfway between a laugh and something harder. "Yes," she said, "I think it is." Ray Tillman's sentencing happened on a Tuesday morning in December. Claire was not in the courtroom. She had not been asked to be, and she had not offered because she thought that what Ray needed in that moment was not her presence, but the structure of his own choices being weighed on their own merits. She read the outcome online sitting in her car outside the diner before her shift. 18 months in a minimum security facility with credit for time served and immediate eligibility for a rehabilitation and vocational program that was jointly run by the county and a workforce development nonprofit. The sentencing judge noted Ray's cooperation, his age, his lack of prior violent offenses, and what the judge described as a moment of moral clarity that had prevented further harm on the night of the robbery. Claire read that phrase, moment of moral clarity, and she thought about Ray's finger moving away from the trigger, about the specific second in which he had looked at her and looked at the shotgun and made a decision that he had not yet fully understood the consequences of, but had made anyway. She sat in her car for a few minutes, then she went inside and put on her apron and made the coffee. Alan Graves called that afternoon. "He wants you to know he read your message," the public defender said. "Which message?" Claire said, though she knew. "The one you sent through me, about the second choice mattering." "How is he?" "Scared," Alan said, "but present, which is more than I expected at the beginning." "Tell him I said the scared part is okay," Claire said. "He knows how to be scared and still make the right choice. He's already done it once." Alan said he would tell him. He thanked her. He hung up. She served coffee to 4 tables and argued with Danny about the ventilation system, which was broken again, and helped a young mother whose toddler had knocked his entire plate onto the floor. And at 2:30 in the afternoon, she sat down for the first time all day on Maria's stool behind the counter, and she thought for the first time in a long time about what came next. Not Julian. Not the federal case. Not the articles or the comments or the phone calls from numbers she did not recognize. What came next for her, specifically for Claire Morgan, 34 years old, double-shift waitress person who had spent the last 4 months in the middle of something that had required more of her than she had known she had to give, and had left her on the other side of it with a particular kind of exhaustion that was not entirely unpleasant. She thought about her father and about the conversation they had had. "You're not responsible for fixing every problem perfectly," and about the way he had said it with the specific authority of a man who had spent 22 years being the voice on the other end of the line when things went wrong, who had learned better than almost anyone that you could do your best, and the outcome could still be terrible, and you could do your best, and the outcome could be better than you expected. And the doing of your best was the only variable you actually controlled. She thought about the business card in the kitchen drawer. She took it out that evening when she got home, and she read it again, both sides. Julian's sentence and her own reply, written in the particular handwriting she used when she was thinking, rather than when she was composing the handwriting that was slightly messier and more immediate and more honest. "You saw the frightened person before you saw the weapon. Seeing people is not a gift, it is a responsibility." She had written that reply in the diner 3 weeks after the robbery, when she was still having nights where she did not sleep, and mornings where her hands surprised her by shaking when she was still close enough to the event itself that it colored everything she looked at. She had written it and put the card back on his desk because she had wanted to say something that was true, and she did not want to say it out loud, not yet, not with everything still so close and uncertain. She looked at the card for a long time. She thought about responsibility not as a burden, not as an obligation, but as the thing that connected you to other people, the thing that said you had seen them and could not pretend otherwise. She put the card back in the drawer. She made a phone call, not to Julian. She called Lena Brooks. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right," Lena said. "The program Ray is going into," she said. "The vocational one. Do they have room for more participants?" A pause. "They might. Why?" "I've been thinking about something," Claire said. "I know what it looks like from the outside when someone is about to make a bad decision because no one has given them a better option. I've been reading people in difficult situations for 10 years. I've been, whether I meant to or not, doing a version of crisis management every shift I've worked since I was 22. "Yes," Lena said slowly. "And I think there's something worth building from that," Claire said. "Not just for one kid, for a lot of people who work in the kinds of places where the stakes are high and the training is low, and the expectation is that you'll figure it out on your own." A silence. "That's a big idea," Lena said. "I know," Claire said. "You'd need resources, space, a structure." "I know," Claire said again. "And you'd need people who understood both sides, the crisis work and the community context." "I know someone who might help with the curriculum," Claire said, thinking of her father and his 22 years of emergency dispatch. And I know a community board member who has been running a diner in Northside for 32 years and understands the neighborhood better than anyone. And I know a detective who teaches people how to communicate under pressure." Lena was quiet for a moment. Claire could hear her breathing, the careful, considering breath of someone who was running the idea through a framework. "And funding," Lena said. "There's a compensation fund," Claire said, "under independent administration. I'm not in charge of it and I'm not making any claims on it. But I know the administrator and I know what the fund is designed for, supporting the community affected by the scheme." "You'd have to apply like anyone else," Lena said. "I would apply like anyone else," Claire said. Another silence. Then, "Send me an outline," Lena said. "I'll look at it." Claire hung up. She sat at her kitchen table in the quiet of the apartment, and for the first time since the November morning, when she had sat in the same chair with the same coffee and read about Ray Tillman's age on her phone, she felt the particular quality of stillness that was not exhaustion and not absence, but something closer to the beginning of something. She opened her laptop. She started to type. Outside Pittsburgh moved through its December evening with the same blunt persistence it had applied to every evening before it. The traffic, the cold, the specific sound of a city that continued, regardless of what happened in any particular kitchen within it. She typed for 2 hours. When she stopped, she had the outline of something that did not yet have a name but had a shape, a real shape with edges and purposes, and the specific grounded ambition of a person who understood both the problem and some of the tools for addressing it. She saved the document. She named it for the moment simply "What Comes Next." She closed the laptop. She went to bed. She slept. The document she had named "What Comes Next" went through 11 drafts over the following 3 months. The first draft was 8 pages and too idealistic. Her father read it and said with the specific kindness of someone who loves you enough to tell you the truth, that it read like a manifesto rather than a plan, and that manifestos were good for inspiration but difficult to fund. The second draft was 4 pages and too cautious. Maria read it and said it sounded like something written by a committee, which was not a compliment. The third draft. Claire threw away entirely at 2 in the morning after reading it back to herself and recognizing the voice of someone performing competence rather than actually possessing it. By the 4th draft, she had stopped trying to write the document she thought other people needed to read and had started writing the document that was actually true, and after that the drafts got shorter and cleaner and more specific in the way that things always got shorter and cleaner when you stopped protecting yourself from your own ideas. The funding application to the Community Compensation Fund went in on a Thursday in late January. It was 17 pages, including appendices. The administrator, a woman named Patricia Chen, who ran the Community Development Office out of a building on Federal Street, with the specific, competent warmth of someone who had seen 100 proposals and could tell within the first paragraph which ones were real, called Claire 4 days later. "I read it twice," Patricia said. "Okay," Claire said. She was behind the counter at the diner. She had answered the call because Lena Brooks had told her to answer any call from a 412 number she didn't recognize for the next 2 weeks. "The second time I read it," Patricia said, "I gave it to my colleague and asked her to tell me what she thought without me telling her anything about it first." "What did she say?" "She said it was the most specific proposal she'd read in 2 years, Patricia said, "which coming from her is significant because she reviews 40 proposals a year and she is not generous with that word." Claire let out a breath that she had been holding, she realized, for approximately 72 hours. "We have questions," Patricia said. "I'd like to schedule a meeting." The meeting happened the following week. Claire brought her father and a 3-page addendum she had written at midnight 2 days before, which addressed 3 of the questions she had anticipated and 2 she had not. Frank Morgan sat beside her in the conference room and answered questions about the emergency response curriculum with the precision of a man who had spent 22 years building exactly the kind of knowledge being asked about. And Claire watched Patricia Chen's expression shift gradually and then decisively from evaluation to interest. The fund approved a 12-month operational grant 2 weeks later. It was not enough money to do everything. It was enough money to start. She called Lena Brooks from her car parked outside the fund's office on Federal Street and said 2 words, "We're approved." Lena made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh of relief, which was the most unguarded sound Claire had ever heard from her and which she found unexpectedly moving. "Now the hard part," Lena said. "Now the hard part," Claire agreed. The building took 6 weeks to find. She had a set of requirements that were specific and non-negotiable: ground floor accessible entrance, enough square footage for a classroom and 2 smaller rooms, and within walking distance of the Riverside Diner, because she was not willing to build something in her community and then locate it somewhere that community couldn't reach without a car. The 4th property she looked at was a building directly across the street from the diner. It had been a hardware store for 30 years and had sat empty for the last 18 months. It was also a Moretti property. Specifically, it was one of the properties now under independent management oversight, the board that Julian had established and from which he had removed himself entirely. Claire stood on the sidewalk across from the Riverside Diner and looked at the empty building and thought about the specific irony of this for long enough that Maria came out of the diner, saw her standing there, looked at the building and said, "You're kidding." "I'm not," Claire said. "That's a Moretti building," Maria said. "Under independent management," Claire said. "I would be leasing from the board, not from Julian." Maria was quiet for a moment. She looked at the building. She looked at her diner. She looked at Claire. "My mother used to say that everything comes back around," Maria said. "She did not always mean it as a comfort." "I know," Claire said. "I think I'm going to lease it anyway." Maria looked at her for another moment. "Yes," she said, "I think you probably are." The lease negotiation with the independent board was the most transparent process Claire had experienced in the entire preceding year, which she found both refreshing and slightly disorienting. The board had 3 community members on it who knew the neighborhood, knew the history, and had strong opinions about what the space should be used for. They approved the lease at below market rate on the condition that a specific percentage of program slots would be reserved for residents from the 2 neighborhoods most directly affected by the property scheme. Claire agreed immediately. It was not a condition she would have needed to be asked for. She told Ray Tillman about it in a letter. He was 4 months into his 18-month sentence and 2 months into the vocational program, and Alan Graves had told her that he was doing what the program required of him, not more, not less, which was exactly where you needed someone to be before you could talk about what came after. She wrote 2 paragraphs. She told him the center was real and that it was opening and that there was a training track for people with relevant experience at a program like the one he was in, and that when he was eligible and interested, the door was open. She did not promise him anything. She did not offer him salvation. She told him the door was open because that was the accurate thing, and accuracy was what she had always had to offer. He wrote back 3 weeks later. It was handwritten, which surprised her in the careful, slightly uneven handwriting of someone who did not write by hand often, but had decided that this letter required it. He said he was working on it. He said he thought about the diner, sometimes not the robbery part specifically, but the moment after. The moment when he had set the shotgun on the table and the adrenaline was still running and his hands had nothing to hold, and he had stood in the middle of a diner not knowing what came next, and she had said simply, "Sit down." He said, "You didn't say I was brave or I did the right thing or any of that. You just told me to sit down, and I think that was actually what I needed." Claire read the letter twice. She put it in the drawer with the business card. The Morgan Conflict and Crisis Center opened on a Friday evening in late October, exactly 11 months after a man named Derek Sims had pushed open the door of the Riverside Diner too fast with too much force and changed the trajectory of more lives than he had intended. The opening was not a gala. It was not a press event. Claire had been asked twice by people with good intentions whether she wanted media coverage of the opening, and she had said both times that she would prefer to let the work speak before she let anyone write about it. What she wanted the opening to be was exactly what it was, a room full of people who had something to do with what the center existed for. Eating food that Maria had organized through a catering arrangement with 3 restaurants in the neighborhood, talking to each other about the thing they had come to learn or teach or simply understand better. There were restaurant workers and nurses and teachers and 2 EMTs who had heard about the program through the Allegheny County Emergency Services Network, which Frank Morgan had called with the particular authority of a man who had 22 years of goodwill banked in that institution. There were 6 young adults from the vocational partnership, not Ray, not yet, but young men and women who were at the beginning of a second chance they had not yet decided to trust. There were people from both neighborhoods who had been directly affected by the property scheme, people who had sold under pressure at prices that did not reflect what they had actually lost, and who were still living with the gap between the compensation they had received and the weight of what had happened. Claire had reached out to each of them personally. She had not promised the center could fix what had been done. She had told them honestly that she was building something and that she wanted them in the room because the room would not be complete without them. Most of them came. Lena Brooks was there. She stood near the coffee station and talked to a group of young adults with the specific practical warmth of a person who had decided to bring her full self into this room rather than the professional version of herself that maintained distance as a form of self-protection. Claire watched her from across the room and thought that Lena Brooks was considerably more interesting than the person she performed at work and made a note to say so. Frank Morgan ran the curriculum overview portion of the evening with a yellow notepad and a calm, unhurried manner that reminded Claire watching him of something she had said in a diner 11 months ago, narrate every movement before you make it. He did not know she was thinking that. He simply did what he always did, gave people information in the order they needed it, without making them feel they should already have it. Patricia Chen was there sitting next to Maria, and at one point Claire looked across the room and saw the two of them deep in a conversation that had the quality of two people discovering they had been thinking about the same problem from different angles for longer than they had known. Julian was there. He had not asked to come. He had not expected to be invited. He had heard about the opening through Lena Brooks, who had mentioned it without exactly inviting him in the particular way that people who wanted something to happen but did not want to be responsible for making it happen communicated those desires. Claire had called him 4 days before the opening. She had said, "You can come, you don't get a seat at the front, and you don't say anything about the fund or your involvement in setting it up, and you don't make the evening about you in any way, but you can come." He had said, "Thank you." Nothing else. Just those 2 words, and she had understood from the way he said them that he understood the conditions and accepted them and was grateful for them in the specific way that people were grateful when they were given exactly what they needed rather than what they might have wanted. I was sitting in this back row when Claire walked to the front of the room. He was wearing a coat that was not the expensive one, something simpler, something that did not announce itself. She noticed it and did not mention it and moved her eyes forward. She had not written a speech. She had started to twice, and both times she had stopped because the speech she was writing was for an audience she was imagining rather than the room that was actually in front of her, and she had learned over the course of the last 11 months that the imagined version of a room was always less real and less important than the actual one. She looked at the room. She looked at the restaurant workers and the nurses and the young adults from the vocational program and the people from Northside who had come because she had asked them personally and because they had decided cautiously that this was worth seeing. She looked at her father, who gave her the smallest possible nod from the second row, the nod that said, "I'm here and I'm proud, and I don't need to say it out loud for it to be true." She looked at Maria, who gave her a different kind of look, the look of a woman who had mopped a floor herself until she was 73, and who understood from the inside what it meant to keep showing up. She looked at the back row, just for a moment. Julian was watching her with an expression she recognized genuine surprise at something, the particular openness of a man who had arrived expecting one thing and was receiving something different and was allowing himself to be changed by the difference. She looked back at the room. "I'm going to say something," she said, "that I've been saying in different ways for 11 months because I think it's the thing that actually matters in everything I've seen and everything that's happened." The room was quiet. Not the performed quiet of people waiting for authority, the actual quiet of people who were present. "Calm is not the absence of fear," she said. "It is the moment we decide that fear will give us information, but it will not give us orders." She let the sentence sit in the air for a moment. "Every person in this room has been afraid," she said, "of something, a dangerous customer, a violent patient, a situation that came at you faster than you were trained for a moment, where the right thing was also the hard thing, and the hard thing was also the costly thing. That fear was not weakness. That fear was data. It was your nervous system doing its job, collecting information about what was happening and presenting it to you." She paused. "What you do with that data, that is the whole game. That is the entire question. Not whether you feel it. Everyone feels it. Not whether it's there. It's always there. The question is what you let it tell you and what you refuse to let it decide." She looked at the back row again. Julian had his hands on his knees and his eyes were very still. "We are going to build something here," she said, "that teaches that distinction. Not fearlessness. I am not interested in fearlessness. Fearlessness is something that people perform when they don't want to be seen as human. What I am interested in is what happens in the half-second between when fear arrives and when you respond. That half-second is trainable. That half-second is where everything that matters actually happens. When she finished, there was a moment of silence before the applause started. A genuine moment. Not the pause of polite timing, but the pause of people who were sitting with something and not yet ready to make noise. She had not expected it, and it caught her somewhere in the chest. That pause, that particular quality of collective absorption, that was the most honest response a room full of people could give you. She stepped back. She let other people move the evening forward, Frank taking over the curriculum section, Lena talking to the young adults from the vocational program with her hands in her pockets, Maria pouring coffee with the specific, generous efficiency of a woman who understood that hospitality was a form of care. The evening wound down slowly, the way good evenings did, with people reluctant to leave a room that had offered them something they had not been expecting. By 9:30, there were only a handful of people left, and by 10 o'clock it was Maria and Frank and Lena and Patricia Chen, who was writing something on a notepad with the expression of someone who had arrived at a decision. And Julian, still in the back row, quiet in the not-expensive coat waiting. Claire walked to the back of the room. She sat down 1 seat away from him, not beside him 1 seat away, because that was accurate, because that was where they actually were. He reached into his coat pocket. He held out a card. She looked at it. It was the business card, the original one, the heavy cream stock with his name embossed in plain black letters, the one she had found beside his untouched coffee 11 months ago and put in her apron and later in her kitchen drawer under the rubber band and the grocery list and the photograph of her father. He had found it on his desk weeks ago. She had left it there during her last day at the Moretti offices before the arrests, before the conversation in the diner at 7 in the morning. She had not said why she left it. She had not needed to. He had kept it. She took it. She turned it over. Both sides were still there, his sentence, her reply written in the handwriting she used when she was thinking rather than composing. You saw the frightened person before you saw the weapon. Seeing people is not a gift. It is a responsibility. She held the card for a moment, then she put it in her pocket. Thank you for coming, she said. Thank you for letting me, he said. They sat in the quiet of the room that had held an hour ago, the sound of 50 people deciding to try something new. Outside, the Riverside Diner's lights were still on across the street. Maria had left them on when she came over, the way she always left them on when she was somewhere nearby, the way a person left a light on for someone they expected to return. The center, Julian said. It's exactly what you said it would be. It's the beginning of it, she said. It's going to be harder next month than it was tonight. Tonight was the easy part. I know, he said. I meant it's real. It's what you actually meant when you described it. I didn't know if... He stopped. He started again. I didn't know if the thing you were building in your head would be the same as the thing you built in that room. It rarely is, she said. Tonight it was close. He nodded. He did not push further. She had noticed over the last several months that he had become considerably better at not pushing further than the thing actually warranted. It was a small change. It was not a small thing. Trust is rebuilt through consistent action, she had told him. She had meant it. She was watching it. She was not ready to make any declarations about what she was watching or where it was going, because declarations were for moments when you had more certainty than she currently had, and she was not the kind of person who performed certainty she didn't possess. What she had was a man sitting 1 seat away from her who had made serious choices and was living inside the consequences of them without trying to make the consequences look different than they were. Who had come to an opening night and sat in the back row and said nothing about himself and left the room better for having been in it. Who had kept a business card for 11 months and returned it without asking for anything in exchange. That was not a declaration. That was data. She was still collecting it. She stood up. She put the card in her pocket next to the one she had carried for 11 months. She picked up her coat. I'm closing up, she said. And then I'm going across the street and helping Maria clean up the diner. Julian stood. I'll go, he said. You can walk out with me, she said. They walked out together. The Pittsburgh October night was cold and clear, and across the street the Riverside Diner was lit and warm, and Maria was already moving behind the counter in the particular efficient rhythm of a woman who had been cleaning up after other people's evenings for 32 years and had never once considered it beneath her. Claire stood on the sidewalk and looked at the diner. She looked at the center with its new sign above the door, Morgan Conflict and Crisis Center in clean letters that her father had picked out and that she had thought were slightly too bold and had been persuaded otherwise by Maria, who said that you had earned the right to be legible. She looked at the two buildings, one her mother had built, one she was building, across from each other on a street in Pittsburgh that someone had once decided would be easier to own if the people on it could be made afraid enough to leave. They had not left. They had stayed and refused and endured, and when the moment came, they had chosen, over and over again, in the ordinary way that people without power chose, not dramatically, not with resources or influence, but with the specific, stubborn, irreplaceable human capacity to decide that fear was information and not instruction. That was the whole story. 11 months, 2 buildings, dozens of people, 1/2 second repeated until it became a practice, a curriculum, a room where 50 people had sat in the quiet of something real and decided to try. Julian said goodnight. He walked toward his car without turning back, which was the right thing to do, and which she noticed he had learned to do without being told. She crossed the street and pushed open the diner door, and Maria looked up from behind the counter and said, "Good coffee or regular?" "Good," Claire said. Maria smiled. She reached for the beans. Claire sat down at the counter, not at a table at the counter, the way she sat when she was staff and not a customer when she was home, rather than visiting, and she put both hands flat on the surface and she breathed, and the diner was warm and the street was quiet, and somewhere across the city, a 19-year-old named Ray Tillman was asleep in a facility that was giving him the second chance that one moment of moral clarity had made possible. And somewhere in the federal court system, a case was being built brick by careful brick that would hold for years. And somewhere in a back row, a man was learning slowly and at significant cost that help was not the same thing as ownership. And here in this diner on this street in this city, a woman sat at a counter with her hands flat on the surface and her breathing even, and her fear present and manageable and useful, exactly what it had always been. And she was not fearless, and she was not finished, and she was not waiting to be rescued. She was exactly where she had decided to be, and that at the end of everything was the only kind of strength that had ever actually mattered.